But first, on the eve of the COP21 talks getting underway, tens of thousands of protesters around the world have organized marches and demonstrations to demand a comprehensive climate deal. In Paris, around 100 people were arrested and police used tear gas to break up a gathering which had been banned under the current emergency laws. But elsewhere, the demonstrations were noisy but peaceful. Paul Brennan reports.
As the global leaders gather and the negotiations get underway, there's been a massive show of expectation from the streets of Europe. London saw the biggest single gathering. More than 50,000 people brightened a grey and windy day with colourful costumes and a unified demand for a comprehensive climate deal.
We need the change, and there's no time better than now.
There's a lot of oil lobbyists, there's a lot of big business lobbyists, but, you know, we've got to try, haven't we?
I've never done anything like this at all before in my life, but you come to a point where you have to do something.
Also there were the fashion designer Vivienne Westwood with the Oscar-winning actress Emma Thompson and the singer and activist Peter Gabriel.
Politicians are certainly becoming aware that a lot of the people of the planet are really worried about this issue and really feel it's a serious threat. So hopefully they will respond, and I think that's part of the aim of this march and these marches going on all over the world.
What's striking is the number of different groups which have come together today under the one banner of fighting climate change. There are animal conservation charities, there is water and energy lobby groups, and there are unions, families and individuals too. The message from these protesters to the politicians meeting in Paris is clear: do a deal, and do a deal that will last. The atmosphere in Paris, host city of the COP21 talks, began peacefully. With public protests banned since the Paris attacks, some 10,000 people instead placed pairs of empty shoes in the Place de la République. But later, the mood turned violent and police fired tear gas to break up protesters who threw glass bottles and other projectiles. Around 100 arrests were made. In the Greek capital, Athens, demonstrations convened outside Parliament, many expressing solidarity with the demonstrators banned from marching in Paris.
It's a global celebration day. No matter if our colleagues in Paris can walk for the climate or not, we can do it for them, we can do it on their behalf. Today is a day where citizens from all around the globe are sending a clear message to governments.
There were similar gatherings across Europe. In Madrid, a crowd estimated at 20,000 people took to the streets, with smaller gatherings in cities such as Barcelona, Las Palmas and Seville. More than 10,000 people congregated in Berlin, with speeches demanding ambitious climate targets which will make a real difference. And in Brussels, demonstrators bypassed a ban on large gatherings by spreading out in a human chain containing around 2,000 protesters. The calls have been loud and clear. It's now up to global leaders and their negotiators to try to make those ambitions a reality. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, the process of reaching an agreement on climate change is inevitably challenging. Al Jazeera's Nick Clark sent us this report from Paris.
Final preparations are made, the finishing touches applied. In a bizarre tradition of the world of diplomacy, this little corner of France becomes UN territory for the duration of the conference. And it is indicative of just how anticipated this event is when the UN climate chief is pursued by the media throng just for going on a tour of the site. Well then, what can we expect?
What is being finalized here in Paris over the next 2 weeks is none other than the second legally binding instrument under the convention that will then go into effect in 2020 once we are through with the Kyoto Protocol.
But many are asking, to what extent can any Paris agreement be legally binding? There are no end of obstacles in the way.
This time, world leaders are coming at the beginning of the conference rather than at the end, which is normal procedure, in a bid to build much-needed momentum. Lima, Warsaw, Doha, the infamous Copenhagen in Denmark, the previous climate summits trip off the tongue as a roll call of inaction and little progress.
And all the science says there is no time to lose. From wildfires to cyclones, the effects of extreme weather are evident. Oceans are warming, seas are rising. The target is to stop temperatures increasing beyond 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Beyond that, the effects could be globally catastrophic. Jim Hansen is a former NASA scientist who's been warning of the dangers of climate change since the 1980s.
If all that Paris amounts to is what it appears to, where it appears to be headed, with no real global reductions in emissions, then our children and grandchildren will inherit a situation that is out of their control. The ocean will keep getting warmer, ice sheets will begin to melt faster and faster, and our coastal cities will be doomed.
Nearly every country at the negotiations has put forward proposals on how they plan to keep emissions down. Trouble is, they're not enough.
The commitments leave us with something like 3 degrees warming over pre-industrial times. And just to give a sense of perspective, right now we're at 1 degree. And at 1 degree, we're already seeing the hottest year ever. Last year was also the hottest year ever. Next year will also be very hot. We're seeing record storms, droughts, heat waves, and other freak weather events that scientists tell us are all about climate change.
The challenges are enormous. The debate will be hard and furious over the coming days in the search for a united front against climate change. Nick Clark, Al Jazeera, Le Bourget, Paris.
Well, joining us live now on Skype from Paris is the global climate and energy leader of the World Wildlife Fund, Samantha Smith, who we saw in that report just now. Ms. Smith, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Now, you mentioned that the challenges are enormous. We've also seen the public really care this time, and a lot of people, as we saw in previous reports, really take to the streets trying to put pressure on their politicians. But ultimately, do you think that that will be enough to get the kind of agreement out of Paris that the world needs?
So it was amazing to see how many people, and people of all kinds, as you heard, grandparents, families, union leaders, people from environmental organizations, youth, people turned out to show that they want action on climate from their leaders. Now, what will they get? Well, I think what we'll see tomorrow when over 150 world leaders get into town, we will see really strong political signals from some of them, signals which can be new commitments on finance, on cutting emissions, getting more renewable energy, getting out of fossil fuels and protecting forests. And then we'll see 2 weeks of negotiations where negotiators are going to have to take those signals and turn them into a document that is going to help us stay under 2 degrees.
And I guess the key element of that document is that it has to be, and here's the magic word that's been coming up over the past few days, legally binding. How crucial do you think it is that it's legally binding? Because we could just see, news conferences at the end of the Paris summit of people saying, yes, we're going to do our best. But if it's not legally binding, then actually it's probably not going to be worth the paper it's written on.
The absolute most important thing is that countries walk out of here and they act with urgency and ambition. And if they need a legally binding agreement to do that, that's one thing. But what we're seeing already is that countries are putting things on the table, starting to deliver on them without necessarily having all pieces of a legally binding agreement in place.
So let me just make that clear then. So you don't think that there necessarily needs to be a legally binding agreement for change to happen and to keep us within the 2 degrees Celsius rise?
We would love to see a legally binding agreement. What we think we're going to see is an agreement where some parts of it are binding and some parts are not. And what we also see is that even in the run-up to the COP, we see that countries are taking action, we see cities taking action, we see workers and unions making commitments on climate, we see business doing the same thing. So overall, we see a picture where a lot of change is happening, an energy transition is starting, and we hope we're going to get a fair, ambitious, and transformational agreement. The question of bindingness is complicated, right? As we said, some parts will be binding, some parts we're pretty sure won't be.
Samantha Smith, Global and Climate Energy Initiative from the World Wildlife Fund. Madam, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.